There is a sentence that has survived 800 years, passed from person to person, copied by hand, whispered in monasteries, written on the walls of shrines, translated into dozens of languages, carried across continents and centuries by people who read it and felt something shift inside them that they could not explain. The sentence is this: die before you die, and discover there is no death. 8 words. And most people read them and move on because they sound poetic, because they sound like the kind of beautiful thing mystics say that does not mean anything practical, because the idea of dying before you die sounds either metaphorical or morbid, and neither seems particularly useful on a Tuesday morning. But Rumi was not being poetic for the sake of beauty. Rumi was being precise. He was describing something he had experienced, something that cracked him open and remade him completely. Something that took the person he thought he was and dissolved it, and left something behind that was more real, more alive, more free than anything the old self had ever managed to be. He was not talking about physical death. He was talking about something that is in some ways harder. The death of the self you have been performing, the death of the identity you have been protecting, the death of the story you have been telling about who you are, what you deserve, what you are capable of, and what the world owes you. That death, the one that has to happen before real life can begin. You have been building a self since you were old enough to understand that other people were watching. You learned very early what got approval and what got silence, what made the people around you warm toward you and what made them pull back, what version of you was safe to show and what version needed to stay hidden. And slowly, so slowly you never noticed it happening, you built a character, a constructed identity, a version of yourself designed to navigate the world as you found it. Some of it was useful, some of it was necessary. Some of the walls you built were built for good reason. There were things that needed protecting. There were environments where the full unguarded version of you would not have been safe. The construction was not wrong. It was survival. It was intelligence. It was what a child does when the world asks them to become manageable. But here's what happened. The character you built to survive, you forgot was a character. You started to believe it was you. The mask became the face. The performance became the identity. And you have been maintaining it, defending it, building it bigger and stronger and more elaborate ever since. This is what Rumi called the ego. Not ego in the psychological sense of self-esteem. Ego in the deeper sense. The false self, the constructed self, the self that is always managing how it appears, always calculating how it is being perceived, always protecting its image, its reputation, its version of events, its place in the hierarchy, always needing to be right, always needing to be seen, always needing to be more than it secretly fears it is. And this self, this constructed, maintained, defended self is exhausting to be. Not occasionally, constantly. Because it is built on a foundation that requires endless maintenance. The moment you stop feeding it, the moment you stop performing, it starts to feel like it is collapsing. And so you feed it again and again and again until feeding the false self becomes the primary activity of your entire life. The ego does not just cost you energy, it costs you everything that actually matters. It costs you presence. Because the ego is never in the moment. The ego is always in the narrative, the story about the moment, how you are coming across, whether you said the right thing, whether you are being appreciated, whether this is going the way it should. You are sitting at a dinner table with people you love, and a part of you is somewhere else, managing, calculating, performing, comparing. The moment is happening and you are watching it from behind a screen of self-consciousness, present in body, absent in everything that counts. It costs you intimacy, because the ego cannot be truly known. The ego is in the business of impression management, and impression management is the opposite of intimacy. Real intimacy requires showing the parts that are not impressive, the confused parts, the frightened parts, the parts that have not figured it out yet, the parts that failed and did not recover gracefully. The ego will not allow this. The ego says if they see that part, they will leave, and so nobody ever sees it. And so nobody ever really knows you. And so you live, sometimes for decades, in relationships that are real in many ways and never quite fully real in the only way that truly matters. It costs you growth, because the ego cannot be wrong. And the person who cannot be wrong cannot learn. The ego will always find a way to explain the failure that does not require the self to change. It was their fault. The circumstances were unfair. The timing was wrong. Anyone would have done the same. The ego is a machine for generating explanations, and every explanation it generates is a wall between you and the thing that could actually make you better. It costs you peace, because the ego is always under threat. Some comment, some look, some slight real or imagined is always arriving. everything, and every threat to the image is experienced as a threat to survival. The ego cannot distinguish between genuine danger and someone disagreeing with it. Both feel like emergency, and so you live in a low-grade state of defense, always slightly braced, always slightly ready for the thing that is going to expose you. And that bracing, held for years, held for a lifetime, is one of the most exhausting things a human body can do. Ego death sounds violent. It sounds like destruction. It sounds like something is being taken from you. But people who have experienced it, genuinely, fully, describe it in almost exactly the same words, regardless of the tradition they came from, the century they lived in, or the language they used. They say it felt like relief, not like loss. Like the end of a very long, exhausting performance. Like putting down a weight you had carried so long you forgot it was not part of you. Like the moment after you stopped trying to hold something together that was never going to hold, and the relief of the collapse is so complete that you cannot believe you spent so long preventing it. Ego death is not the destruction of the self. It is the dissolution of the false self, the constructed self, the performed self. What remains, what has always been there underneath the performance, is the actual self, the self that does not need to be managed because it is not trying to be anything other than what it is, the self that does not need approval because it is not built on approval, the self that can be wrong and still be whole, that can fail and still be enough, that can be seen fully, completely, without the careful editing, and not be destroyed by the seeing. Rumi knew this because it happened to him. He was a respected scholar, a man of position and learning and carefully cultivated dignity. And then he met Shams of Tabriz. And Shams, who had no patience for dignity in the way Rumi had constructed it, dismantled him. Conversation by conversation, challenge by challenge, until the scholar who had spent his life building an impressive self found the impressive self completely inadequate and fell apart. And in the falling apart, found everything he had been looking for in the building. His most important poetry came after the dissolution, not before it. Not during the construction of the impressive self, after it fell, when he was no longer managing the image, when he had nothing left to protect, when the ego was gone and what remained was just Rumi, raw, broken, fully alive, writing from a place that the constructed self never had access to. Most people do not choose ego death. Most people are brought to it by a loss they could not manage their way through, by a failure so complete that no explanation was adequate, by a relationship that required a level of honesty the ego could not provide and therefore ended, by an illness that stripped everything that the identity was built on, by a moment, sometimes very ordinary, where the whole performance suddenly felt so hollow, so exhausting, so completely disconnected from anything real, that they simply could not do it anymore. These moments are terrifying when they happen. They feel like breaking. They feel like the end of something. They feel, from inside them, like the worst thing that has ever happened. The person you thought you were is coming apart. The story you have been telling about your life is no longer holding. The ground beneath the identity is shifting, and there is nothing solid to stand on. And this is exactly the moment Rumi was pointing to. Not the moment before the crack, not the carefully managed life before the dissolution, the crack itself. The moment when everything you built to protect yourself stops working, and you are left with whatever was underneath the building. The Sufi tradition calls it fana, annihilation, the dissolution of the ego self in the encounter with something larger. Christianity calls it dying to self. Buddhism calls it the dissolution of the separate self. Different languages, different centuries, different traditions, all pointing to the same experience, the same necessary undoing, the same terrifying, liberating, completely irreversible opening. What comes through the crack is not what the ego feared would be there. The ego feared emptiness, meaninglessness, the collapse of everything. But what the people who have been through it consistently report is the opposite. Not emptiness, fullness, not the end of the self, the beginning of the real one, not less, more present, more alive, more genuinely themselves than they had ever managed to be inside the construction. Most people are being run by their ego completely and do not know it, not because they are unaware or unintelligent, because the ego is so deeply woven into how we experience ourselves that it feels like it just is us. There is no gap between the ego and the person. They are the same thing, or they seem to be, but there are signs, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them. You cannot receive criticism without defending yourself, even when the criticism is gentle, even when the person offering it clearly cares about you. Even when some part of you knows they are right, the defense rises before you choose it. Automatic, instant, because the ego experiences any challenge to its self-image as an attack on its survival, and it responds accordingly. You need to be right more than you need to understand. In arguments, in conversations, in the quiet private court of your own mind where you relitigate things that happened years ago and win every time. The need to be right is the ego's loudest operating principle, because being wrong means being less, and being less is the thing the ego was built to prevent. You compare constantly, not sometimes, constantly. A background process running at all times, measuring your life against other people's lives, your achievements against their achievements, your body against their body, your relationship against their relationship. Comparison is the ego checking whether it is ahead or behind, whether it is enough or not enough, whether it is winning or losing the game it invented and invited no one else to play. You perform even when you are alone. You rehearse conversations, you imagine audiences for your own thoughts. You curate even your private moments, the ones nobody will ever see, as if someone is watching. This is the ego so thoroughly integrated that it cannot be switched off even in the absence of other people. It is performing for an imagined observer, and the imagined observer is always the same one, the version of other people the ego has built inside itself to keep the performance running. You cannot force ego death. You cannot plan it or schedule it or achieve it through a technique. And yet there are ways of living that thin the walls, that make the dissolution possible, that create the conditions in which the false self can gradually, incompletely, but genuinely begin to loosen its grip. The first is honesty, not the kind you perform, the kind that costs you something, the kind where you look at yourself, without the flattering light, without the carefully constructed narrative, and see what is actually there, where you are lying to yourself, where you are performing, where you are maintaining a version of events that protects the ego at the cost of the truth. Honest people dissolve slowly. The truth acts on the false self the way water acts on salt. Gradually, inevitably, if you let it. The failure they could not spin into a lesson, the loss they could not frame as a gift, the moment where the tools the ego uses stopped working, and they were left, without the tools, with whatever was underneath them. If you are in a failure right now, a real one, do not waste it by immediately trying to recover your image. Sit in it. Let it do what it came to do. The third is silence. Real silence. Not the absence of noise, the absence of the internal performance. Meditation, prayer, a long walk with no destination and no podcast. Anything that creates a gap between you and the constant commentary the ego runs on everything. In that gap, even briefly, something else becomes audible, something quieter, something that does not need to manage anything, that is not performing for anyone, that is simply there, present, sufficient, real. That is the self underneath the self. And every time you touch it, even for a moment, the ego's grip loosens slightly. When the ego loosens, when the false self begins to dissolve, what people discover is not what they feared. They feared emptiness. They find spaciousness. They feared meaninglessness. They find a meaning that does not depend on achievement or approval or anyone else's assessment of their worth. They feared losing themselves. They find that what they lost was never them. And what they find is the self that remains after ego death is not a lesser self. It is not a broken self. It is not the ruins of what used to be there. It is the self that was always there, underneath the performance. The self that was present before you learned what the world wanted you to be. The self that does not need to win an argument to feel whole. That does not need to be impressive to feel real. That can sit in a room and be nobody in particular and feel completely, sufficiently, quietly alive. This self can love without needing the love to confirm its worth. It can work without needing the work to define its identity. It can fail without the failure becoming its name. It can be seen, all of it, the whole complicated, unfinished truth of it, and not flinch, because there is nothing left to protect, because the protection was the problem. Because the wall that the ego built to keep the self safe was also, all along, the wall that kept the self small. Rumi wrote from this place. Every poem that has survived 800 years and still lands in the chest of someone reading it at 2 a.m. came from after the dissolution, not from the scholar. From what remained when the scholar was gone. The love poetry, the longing, the wine and the fire and the reed flute crying for its origin. All of it came from the place underneath the constructed self, from the self that had nothing left to perform and everything left to feel. That is what is waiting on the other side of the dying. Not less, everything. You do not have to do anything dramatic. You do not have to go to the desert. You do not have to break apart your life. The dissolution does not require a grand gesture. It requires a series of small, honest ones. Today, notice one place where you are performing. One conversation where you are managing an impression rather than being real. One moment where you are defending something that does not actually need to be defended. Just notice it. You do not even have to change it yet. Just see it clearly. The seeing is the beginning. This week, let yourself be wrong about something. Out loud, without the explanation, without the context that softens it. Just, I was wrong about that. 2 seconds of discomfort, and then something lighter on the other side. The ego survives being wrong. The false self does not collapse when you admit it, but your relationship with the false self changes, slightly, permanently. This month, find the silence, even 10 minutes, even uncomfortable and restless and full of the ego's resistance to being still. Sit in it anyway, not to achieve something, not to meditate correctly, just to create the gap in which the real self, however briefly, becomes audible, however faint, however unfamiliar. Listen for it. It has been there the whole time, waiting, with infinite patience, for you to stop performing long enough to hear it. Die before you die, not to lose yourself, to find yourself, the real one. The one that was never the performance, the one that does not need to win or be seen or be impressive or be right, the one that exists before the world told you who to be and has been waiting patiently, faithfully, without judgment, for you to come back to it. The ego will resist this. It will tell you that you need it, that without the performance you are nothing, that the self underneath the construction is not enough, that the world requires the constructed version and the real one would not survive exposure. It is lying. It has always been lying. That is what it was built to do. The real self, the one Rumi found in the ruins of his carefully constructed life, does not need the world's approval to exist, does not need the performance to feel whole, does not need to be anything other than exactly what it is, which is enough, which has always been enough, which was enough before you started building on top of it, and will be enough long after the building is gone. You do not have to wait for something to break you open. You can choose it, slowly, imperfectly, one honest moment at a time, one small death of the false self, one small clearing of the ground, until what remains is not the person you constructed, but the person you actually are. And that person, unperformed, undefended, fully seen and fully present, is the most alive you will ever be. Die before you die, and discover there is no death.